Alright, so this is going to be our underlining demo. Now, remember we underline for a few different reasons. You may underline when you're creating your garment for all the reasons or for just one of them. Okay, so one reason we underline is to, give our fashion fabric more durability, strengthen. Another reason we do it, it will help us hide our stitches, which you'll see in a later demo, so that there's no stitches on the fashion fabric on the outside. They can all be just put into the underlining, so for finishing purposes. And then obviously it changes the nature of your fabric. If you have a thin fabric and you want it to be a little thicker, or you want it to have a little more flow to it and it's stiffer, and it's a very stiff fabric, you can put more of a flowy fabric underneath it and it'll change the nature of that fabric. Okay. Also, you can change the shade of your fabric. If you have a white fabric and you want to have a pinkish, like a pink hue coming from your white fabric, you could put a pink fabric, like a lining fabric or something, underline it with your, you could underline the fashion fabric with a pink fabric, and then it would show, you'd get like a pink hue coming out of that white fabric. So, what does underlining mean? So a lot of people sometimes get lining and underlining confused, all right? The lining is different. That's almost like a separate garment inside your garment. That's what, when you look inside your garment, everything's clean and finished when it's lined. And underlining is another piece of fabric that's cut in the same pattern piece as your fashion fabric. And they're put together and basted together like they're one piece of fabric. So that other fabric underlines your fashion fabric. So here I have a piece of muslin. I drew these red stripes on it. This side with the markings on it signifies the fashion fabric, the right side of the fashion fabric. And then this is the wrong side of the fashion fabric that doesn't have anything. I'm going to underline this piece of muslin with this lining fabric. Okay. So again, you'd have two pattern pieces, all right, cut out, and you preferably cut your fashion fabric and underlining out at the same time. That way they're exactly the same. And you put your underlining down, and then you put your fashion fabric on top. Okay. Now, I didn't do a good job of cutting this out, as you can see, and they don't match up perfectly. Let's actually see if I flip this around, if it's better. It's about the same. Okay, I should have cut them out together. Anyways, you want them to match up perfectly. Okay, so you lay them on top, make sure everything's matching up. Once that happens, you're going to pin around the edges. Okay, and you want to keep both the fashion fabric and the underlining nice and smooth. And notice when I'm pinning it, I'm not picking up my fabric to pin it. Okay, everything's laying nice and flat on the table. What I do is I put my finger in front of where the pin is going in. Okay, so I put a little pressure, and I can put my pin in and pull up and create a little bubble and just push that pin right in. Okay, so you want to not disturb the fabric as much as possible. And we're just going to pin around in, I don't know, 4 or 5 inch increments. And again, make sure it's nice and smooth. Like so. Okay, so now I've secured my underlining to my fashion fabric by pin basting it. Next what I'm going to do is a diagonal basting stitch. Okay, now remember, when basting your fashion fabric, you always want to use white thread, okay, because dyes on other threads, because of the humidity in the air and the heat or whatever, it can cause the dye from the thread to kind of seep onto your garment wherever it's going in and out of your garment. So use white thread, or an ivory at least. Okay, in this case I'm using black, so hopefully you can see it better. But if this was a garment for a client, I would definitely be using white thread. Okay, so we're just going to take one strand of thread. We're not going to knot it or anything because this is basting. You want to be able to pull it out. All right. And we're going to do a diagonal basting stitch. So basically, I'm going to be working right to left. My needle's going to go in from the right side and come out on the left. And I'll take a stitch, and then I'll go about 2 or 3 inches above that, take another stitch and another stitch. So I'm working right to left, and I'm working away from myself. All right, so the first stitch I'm going to take twice because I want to lock it in place. All right, and these are about 1/2 inch stitches I'm taking. So I can easily just pull this stitch out and then pull out the rest. I'm not making anything small here. Okay, now my basting is locked in place. And now I'm going to go up about 3 inches and take another stitch, going in from the right, coming out on the left. And then about 2 or 3 inches above that, same thing. And then another 2 or 3 inches. And there we go. Okay, and you can see how these it makes a diagonal basting, a diagonal stitch, and we call it a diagonal basting stitch. You've done tailoring, this is like the pad stitch but much bigger. I'm going to do 3 rows of this, so I'll do 1 on each side and 1 in the middle. So here's my second row, right in the center, lock in the stitch, 3 or 4 inches above, or 2 or 3 inches above. You don't want to do these small. Any basting you typically don't want to do small because you can ease your fabric. The smaller the stitch, the more stitches you're probably going to take, and the more chances you have of easing your fabric, which you don't want to do. You want your 2 pieces of fabric to be the same and nice and smooth and act as one. It's always important to remember to experiment with different fabrics when it comes to underlining to see what they do to your fashion fabric. Okay. The underlining also keeps show through from happening, so when you press open your seams, you're not going to see any shadow or bumps from those seams the seam allowance being pressed open. Okay, so there we've done it. We've now underlined our fashion fabric with lining. Okay, so that's what the front looks like. This is the fashion, the right side of the fabric, and then here you can probably see the stitches I've taken doing my basting stitch. Okay, so now this has been underlined.